Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Julie Golding, who is a Holocaust educator and museum professional, serving as a professor and the deputy chair of the Masters in Holocaust, Genocide, and Tolerance Education at Tur University. She's also a curator at the Holocaust Museum and Center for Tolerance and Education in Rockland County, New York, and will be discussing her newly published book, which is Unseen Scars, Vicarious Trauma at Holocaust Museums, Exhibitions, and Memorial Sites, and it is published by Bloomsbury. So thank you, Dr. Golding, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
What can you tell the listeners about your book?
Okay, so my book is about the Holocaust, trauma, and how we tell these stories today. So it's about what happens when we learn about another person's pain, how we're affected by it, and our capacity, our ability to develop both vicarious trauma and vicarious resilience by learning about this history.
What do you mean by vicarious trauma?
So trauma is defined by the American Psychological Association by a person's response to a terrible event. So it's not the event itself, but it's how a person reacts to it. And when a person experiences a moment of trauma, they have a breakdown of their sense of self, a breakdown of the sense of time, and kind of like a shattering of the world around them. But vicarious trauma, I like to compare it to secondhand smoke, which means you're not the person holding the cigarette, but you're the person breathing it in. So what happens when you encounter someone else's trauma, someone else's pain? And that can happen by coming into contact with images, artifacts, testimony, information about some really painful episodes and traumatic experiences in someone else's life. Vicarious trauma really stems from the field of mental health. It's something that's been recognized in the field of mental health for many years, and only something that we're really starting to recognize in the field of education, and particularly Holocaust education.
So let's, I guess, move over from, like you said, the mental health field, using these kind of terms that do sound very mental health-y, if you will, and take it over to Holocaust education, and show the listener, I guess, and this is what you do throughout your book, the connection.
So Holocaust education takes place in many different forms. I've been working in Holocaust education for more than 2 decades, but the experience of people being affected by the Holocaust knowledge is really dates back a lot further than that. I like to share in my book a story that happened to my grandfather. My grandfather was a survivor of the Holocaust. He was originally from Germany. His family fled to Holland after Kristallnacht, after the November pogrom. And while his parents and 2 sisters were deported and murdered in Sobibor, he fled. He joined an underground and he fled. He survived the war, attempted an escape over to Spain, which was unsuccessful, ended up in the Neuengamme concentration camp, and eventually was liberated by being taken to Sweden. After that, he ended up first in Denmark and then in New York, where he became a teacher for more than 50 years, including 40 years in Breuer's in Washington Heights. Now, most people know him as a teacher of French and a teacher of Dikduk. And what most people don't remember about him is that for a very short period of time, he was tasked with teaching about the Holocaust. It was 1996. Holocaust education was gaining prominence. The United States Holocaust Museum had recently opened. Schindler's List had been produced. There was a lot of awareness about wanting to teach about the Holocaust. And the school decided they're going to offer a course, and he looked like a perfect candidate for it. 6 classes into teaching the course, he was walking into the building. It was December, and he was walking into the building. And as he walked up the stairs, he overheard one kid cracking a joke and said, "Here comes Mr. Hellman. Here we go back into the gas chambers again." And at that point, he turned around and walked out of the building, and he never again attempted to teach about the Holocaust. Now, I'd always heard this story, but after he passed away, we found in his papers his lesson plans for these classes, and I could see that he had actually developed 6 classes, and it stopped after that point. Now, I know that day the conversation ended. It ended with a kid cracking a joke, or perhaps saying something because he was uncomfortable with what he was learning about. But what we know is that the conversation ended. Today, we know that when a kid makes a comment like that, and what I've done in my research, in my book, is taking a look at the types of comments, reactions that students are having to learning about the Holocaust and trying to dig deeper in understanding what is it that is causing these types of reactions? What is it that is causing students to either engage deeply, disengage, use humor, or use other different coping styles to process what they're learning about the Holocaust? And how can we, as educators and as people who want to continue to tell this story, successfully engage students and continue to engage students even when they appear to be not interested?
As you mentioned, this difficulty, and I'm sure many here listening are familiar to some degree, right, varying degrees rather, with the Holocaust. So there is a difficulty inherent in teaching it, in learning about it. So how do you approach that, and how do you, in your own teaching and throughout the book?
I think you zoomed in on the word difficulty, and that's an important word because what we're talking about here is difficult histories. The Holocaust falls into the genre of difficult histories, not controversial histories, but difficult because they sit at this juncture, they sit at this point of knowing too much and not quite knowing enough. And what happens is that information is overwhelming rather than empowering. Holocaust studies also sits in an area of what we call dark tourism, which is visiting sites that are related to death, to suffering, to mass atrocities. And interestingly enough, there is a rise in dark tourism in the last several years. People like to visit places like prison tours, cemetery tours. They even like to visit nuclear disaster sites, despite the fact of increased radiation when visiting these sites. So we have Holocaust history and Holocaust education falling under this field of difficult history and dark tourism. And I've encountered this so many times in my work. One of the stories that comes to mind is my first year of teaching, where I was a very prepared teacher. I was teaching my first year of teaching Holocaust studies. I had taught before, but I was hired to teach a year-long course in Holocaust studies. And I had a class full of engaged students, except for one. I'll call her Rachel. Rachel sat in the back of the classroom. She didn't say very much. But as the year went on, I tried to reach out to her. I tried to connect. I spoke to the principal, but nothing seemed to work. The principal basically said, she's a shy student, leave her alone. At the end of the year, on the final day of class, I handed out the final exam. And after a little while, Rachel brought up her paper. On her paper, it was completely blank, except for the following words. Thank you for teaching me this year. Your class wasn't as bad as I expected. I didn't see any dead bodies. And I realized that something was really wrong. And when I really dug into the story deeper, I had learned that when Rachel was a young girl, she and her sister had heard the music of a passing ice cream truck. And when they ran out to go get some ice cream, as they crossed the street, a car hit her sister, who was killed on impact. And that she had witnessed this terribly traumatic, she had this terribly traumatic moment. And the school said she had also they had taken her to a Holocaust museum and she had a really hard time with it. I realized in that moment, I was stunned by her story. I was stunned by the fact that I didn't know. And I was also stunned by the idea that had I known, I don't know what I would have done differently that year. I had the tools. I was prepared to teach about the Holocaust, but I wasn't prepared for the emotional impact of it. A couple of years later, I had another incident that made me really realize how different Holocaust education is from other topics. It was a little after Sandy Hook, the largest elementary school shooting in the United States to date. And I was at a conference for educators, for school leaders. And there was a session about crisis management and preparedness for disasters. The session focused on lockdown drills, preparing different rooms, stocking water bottles, and all the various things that were related to lockdowns and what people needed to start doing. After a while, the conversation turned to student mental health and the fact that children were frightened by the drills themselves, by the loud noises, by fears that things could happen. And that's when I realized sitting in that room that all those educators were working to protect their students from difficult knowledge, but I was knowingly introducing them to mass atrocities, to death, to starvation. And I realized how fundamentally different my role was when teaching about the Holocaust to the other people in the room. And at that point, I actually left my full-time job, went back to research this question. What does it mean to learn about someone else's pain? And what does it mean to learn about a difficult history? And how are we affected, especially if we ourselves have previously experienced a trauma?
You've mentioned the kind of a difficulty there. So what are the various approaches to teaching difficult topics, specifically the Holocaust, and not only to students? We talked about students, but also to the general public. I mean, you're speaking now to the general public, so there is an inherent difficulty there as well.
Absolutely. So Holocaust education, I like to say, is like the wild, wild west. Everybody puts out there whatever they think is meaningful, whether it's programming, whether it's articles in magazines that we encounter on a weekly basis, videos that we want to put out. There's no regulation. Currently, 32 states mandate Holocaust education, but even those states that mandate it have very little guidance on what to do or how to do it. Some states do it better than others. In the frum community, especially, we put out a lot of stories about our families, about what we know. And we just encounter along the way. There's a certain assumption about what we know and what we need to know. And so what's important to realize is that when we encounter these stories, as I said, vicariously, we sort of inhale the pain of another person. And some key words we really need to think about is the idea of empathy versus sympathy. So sympathy is really feeling sorry for another person, but empathy is an act of connection. And very often in Holocaust education, we have the goal of creating empathy. It'll be in a lot of mission statements of organizations. And it's even something we toss around a lot and just within our community. Oh, I want to empathize with the person. And that's why survivor testimony is so powerful, because you have the ability to connect and really connect to another person's story. And when you think about what goes on in our community, I'll give you some examples. You mentioned not just in education itself, but how could we possibly see it in our children, in the people around us? I was working in a museum and I noticed it was a group of Hasidic students who had come to the museum. And I noticed that after they had left a little package of oodles on the floor. So as likely the listeners know, oodles are these like candies. When you open it up, there's like a gazillion little pieces. They fall on the floor. It's miserable to pick it up. And on the packet, the class president who had organized the trip had written, remember the oodles of Yidden who perished in the Holocaust. I was shocked by that. It was this kind of souvenir that they had given out to go to the Holocaust Museum representing 6 million Jews in candies, in little candies. And that is an act of sympathy. That's feeling bad, but that's not really connecting and empathizing with their pain. Versus another story that I can share was a teacher who was invited to come along on a class field trip. And I encountered this teacher in one of the classrooms and she was crying. She was sobbing hysterically. When I asked her, what is it? Like, is everything okay? What's going on? Your students are in the gallery. You're here. She said, I can't watch the videos. I don't know how they're watching the videos. And when we drilled down, I realized it was one video that she was focused on. And that video was the video of the children being taken away from their parents. And at that moment, she shared with me that she was going through a very difficult divorce and she was fighting for custody of her children. And watching the videos of her children, of those children being taken away from their parents was just too much for her. She connected so deeply with their story that she couldn't even stay in that space. And so if we want people to connect with the information that we're putting out there, whether it's on Tisha B'Av, whether it's in the many stories we put out there, the family stories we want to continue, we need to really think about how we're doing this responsibly.
So another thing that you discuss is preserving the lived experience. The lived experience. Another thing you discuss is preserving the lived experience and not just facts. This is something that happens not only in Holocaust education or Holocaust history, but Holocaust history specifically, as there are still survivors. And this is something that you don't want to just convey facts. So, and really within the lived part is the role of survivor testimony. I'm kind of like mixing that in. So you kind of should discuss both of these. I know this is something that you discussed.
So when one of the best techniques for teaching about the Holocaust is sharing the story of the individual. So connecting to one individual person. The number 6 million or 6 to 8 million is just massive. It's too hard to comprehend. It's just, as we say, comprehending the incomprehensible. And so we always want to understand the story of an individual. When I teach about the Holocaust, I like to always say we're going to talk about how people lived and not how people died. We're going to talk about the choices that people made and the resilience that they showed in their lives. And so actually the flip side of vicarious trauma is vicarious resilience. If we have the capacity, the ability to absorb someone else's pain, we have the ability to absorb their strength as well. And what is resilience? Resilience is, Viktor Frankl best describes it as when you can no longer change a situation, you're challenged to change yourself. So what is it that you can do in a situation when that situation is something you can no longer control? What is it that you can do to change yourself in that moment? As Sherry Mandel says, it's not about overcoming, it is about becoming. It's about changing yourself as a person. So what we're trying to do when we learn about the Holocaust is to focus on how people live, the choices that they make, and to focus on learning from their strength in during that moment, strength in rebuilding, strength in rebirth afterwards, and to try to understand what is it that we can use to train ourselves to sort of inhale that resilience that they can offer and become the strongest version of ourselves because of what we've learned.
What roles do Holocaust museums and memorials play?
So Holocaust museums are very different than classrooms. So when you teach in a classroom, you usually know your students for most of the year. And so you will know what might trigger them, what might get them, their background. You have a chance to prepare them for a difficult encounter, and you have a chance to debrief with them afterwards. In museums, people come in for a very short amount of time. You encounter somebody for an hour or 2 hours. You tell them something, you tell them some important information, some really important stories, and then they leave. And you don't really know how your message landed. And that's why it's important for people who are in those spaces to recognize, and I actually, in my book, I offer this framework of what we call ABC, awareness, balance, connection, about recognizing how to make the most of those visits and how to engage people in those visits. Now, Holocaust museums have become increasingly popular in recent years. As I mentioned earlier, people like to visit them. Students, most adults visit on their own volition. They come because they want to. Students, our children, are often brought there because their school brings them, because they're taken into those spaces. And so we need to realize that these museums, which are incredibly powerful learning spaces, we have the opportunity to prepare, whether it's students or it's our own children or it's ourselves, to go into that space to really take in everything they have to offer.
Who is your book meant for?
So I wrote my book. I wrote the book I wish someone had handed me 20 years ago when I started teaching. And it is geared toward educators, to people who work in schools, for people who plan any sort of programming, whether it's Asara B'Teves, it's Yom HaShoah, it's Kristallnacht, or they're talking about other difficult histories, if they're teaching about October 7th, if they're teaching about any sort of difficulties in Jewish history, teaching about the Churban. And it's also, and at the same time, the idea of trauma and how we inherit trauma, how we encounter things and what that looks like for us is incredibly important. And I'll use the word popular within our community. And so my book is really written for anyone who cares about how we tell this history in the next generation, not just how we tell it in schools. How do we tell it around our Shabbos table, around our Seder table? How do we tell it when we're sitting with our families on Tisha B'Av and we want to share that piece of family history? How are we going to tell it in a way so that people really want to listen and they want to engage, and they're not distracted or disengaged or scared to listen, which is something I've very often heard. I recently gave a talk at a conference, and afterwards, somebody followed up with me. There were a few hundred people in the room. Somebody followed up with me afterwards. He works in an organization, a Jewish organization that designs educational curricula for all different organizations and schools and institutions. And this individual had recently been tasked with developing a Holocaust curriculum for younger students. And he wanted to reach out to learn about what can I do to create a trauma-informed framework. And in the course of our conversation, he shared that when he himself was in 7th grade, when he himself was in 6th grade, he was in a Jewish day school. He told his parents, I don't want to go to Jewish school in 7th grade. I'd like you to transfer me to public school. I'll come back for 8th grade, but just 7th grade, I don't want to stay. And when they finally dug deeper and they got to the bottom of it, they realized he was afraid to take a Holocaust class that was being offered in the school. So, thankfully he had, parents who cared about making sure it was a positive experience. He had his principal who cared to make sure it was a positive experience. And, he was able to successfully navigate that year. But it's something that anyone who's involved in talking about this to the next generation will find incredibly meaningful.
What are you trying to accomplish with this book?
So we're at a crossroad of lived memory and historical memory. There are fewer than 245,000 Holocaust survivors alive today. There are fewer than 1,000 people alive who have survived Auschwitz. And we are transitioning into a period where this memory is going to be one where we're going to tell through secondhand, third-hand, sources. Children born today may never meet a Holocaust survivor. We're going to look at how are we using technology? How are we encountering this information in different spaces? And we need to recognize that the Holocaust knowledge of the Holocaust is not a given in the next generation. So we need to find ways to engage the next generation. It's important to continue to teach and talk about it for all different reasons, for all different audiences. But it's important. And we need to make sure that they continue to learn and that they want to learn and that they feel empowered by the knowledge and not just overwhelmed by it.
Okay, so I'll link to the book in the show notes. It's available on Amazon and through the publisher. But Amazon, I guess, would be the best place for most listeners to buy it. The paperback's around $42. Also, we shouldn't mention, I mentioned in the beginning, but that you are in charge really of the program at Turo, the new master's degree and certificate in Holocaust education, which is a fully online program for people who want to teach about the Holocaust in schools, museums, and other settings. So anyone can reach out to you if they're interested in learning more about that program. And thank you very much for joining me to discuss your book, Unseen Scars.
Thank you for having me here today.